Here's something most people don't talk about. Did Satan have a hand in creating the earth? Yeah, I know that's a crazy thought, right? But hold on, because this question isn't coming out of nowhere. You've probably heard that Satan is the bad guy in the Bible, the ultimate deceiver. But there's this little-known idea, a concept buried deep in ancient Gnostic texts, that flips the entire narrative on its head. Imagine this. The God we read about in the Old Testament, the one who created the world, what if he's not the good guy we've always been told he is? What if he's actually Satan? Yeah, you heard that right. Some early Christian heresies, like the Arphite sect, had this wild belief that the world we live in, the one full of suffering, pain, chaos, that wasn't created by a benevolent God. Instead, it was created by a lesser, flawed being known as the demiurge. And here's the kicker, they equated this demiurge with Satan. In their view, the material world is a prison and humans are trapped here by Satan, who's masquerading as the creator. Pretty wild. It kind of flips the Genesis story upside down. You know how it goes in Genesis 1 verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But if the Gnostics were right, the one doing the creating might not be the God of pure goodness, but instead a being that's keeping us in the dark, trying to prevent us from seeing the true light. Now, let's take a step back. I'm not saying the Bible directly tells us that Satan created the earth, but what if some of those ancient alternate texts were offering a different take on the creation story that didn't make it into the official version we know today? In Gnostic thought, the real God, the one above all, is a being of light, totally different from the one crafting the physical universe. The creation of the earth was seen as flawed from the start and the one responsible. Well, that's where the line between creator and deceiver starts to blur. But here's where things get even crazier. In Job 1 verse 7, Satan is roaming the earth. And in Luke 4 verse 6, Satan straight up claims that the kingdoms of the world were given to him. What if he wasn't lying? Could these be clues hidden in plain sight, suggesting that Satan has a more significant role in this world than we've been led to believe? It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Was the earth designed to be imperfect, full of suffering and hardship, by a creator with a hidden agenda? Could the God in Genesis be playing both roles, the creator and the adversary? In this view, Satan's rebellion might not be about defying God, but about exposing the flawed nature of the world he helped create. Alright, so here's the real question. Why have we never heard these stories? Why don't we see any mention of Satan creating the earth, or these alternative narratives in the Bible we know today? Well, let's talk about something that might make you a little uncomfortable: control. The early church wasn't just concerned with spreading the gospel, they were also very concerned with maintaining authority. And when you're in control of shaping an entire religion, you've got to decide which ideas make it in, and which ones get buried. You've probably heard about the councils of Nicaea and Chalcedon, right? These were the defining moments where church leaders came together to settle some big theological debates and decide once and for all what was orthodox and what was heresy. What's wild is, a lot of early Christian beliefs didn't make the cut. Ever heard of the Gnostic texts? Well, if you haven't, there's a reason for that. These were seen as dangerous, like existential threat level dangerous, to the church's control. Why? Because they didn't follow the official narrative. And here's the kicker. A lot of these texts had creation stories that make Genesis look tame. They had whole cosmologies where the God of the Old Testament wasn't the real God, and where Satan, or figures associated with him, played a crucial role in the creation of the material world. The people in power weren't too happy about these ideas floating around. It was all about making sure one version of the story won out. So what did they do? They banned the books, labeled them heretical, and worked overtime to erase them from history. The result? The creation story most of us grew up with became the only creation story that survived. Think about it. What if this wasn't about spiritual truth, but about controlling the narrative? A lot of early Christian sects believed in radically different versions of creation, versions where Satan or rebellious angels had more influence than we've ever been led to believe. These ideas didn't just get rejected, they got erased. Because in the end, controlling the story meant controlling the people. If you could dictate how the world was created, you could dictate how people understood their place in it, and more importantly, who had the power. Look, it's no secret that religious and political power have always been tied together. If these alternative stories had made it into the Bible, it could have meant chaos for the church's authority. The official version of creation paints a pretty clear picture. One God, one story, one truth. But as we're starting to see, the reality might have been a lot messier and a lot more controversial. So we've touched on why these stories were hidden, but let's get into the real meat of it, Gnosticism. Now, if you've never heard of Gnosticism, don't worry, it's not exactly on the Sunday school syllabus. But it should be. This was a movement that had the potential to change everything about how people understood the universe, creation, and even God. Gnostics weren't just your run-of-the-mill believers. They had an entirely different worldview. While the mainstream Christian church was preaching that the world was good, created by a loving God, the Gnostics looked at the mess of the world, disease, suffering, death, and thought, wait a second. This can't be the work of a perfect creator. To them, the physical world was a trap, a prison, and the being who made it. Not exactly God, at least not in the way we've been taught to think of him. The Gnostics believed in a higher, unknowable God, a pure source of all light and goodness. But the creator of the material world? That's where things get weird. In their view, the world was created by a lower, flawed being, the demiurge. And here's where things get really spicy. The demiurge was often identified with the God of the Old Testament. Yeah, the very same one who said, "Let there be light." But in the Gnostic view, this so-called God wasn't benevolent at all. He was a cosmic jailer, keeping humanity locked in ignorance. And who was helping him keep things in line? None other than Satan, or at least an entity resembling the Satan figure we know. In Gnostic texts like the Apocryphon of John, the demiurge is described as arrogant, ignorant, and downright malevolent. He thinks he's the only God, but the Gnostics saw him as a pretender, someone who created the world to entrap souls in a flawed, material existence. So how did the Gnostics respond to this? With secret knowledge, or gnosis, which they believed could set you free from the physical world and its deceptions. They believed that only by gaining this hidden knowledge could people truly understand their divine origins and break free from the cycle of suffering and death. Gnosticism wasn't just a different take on Christianity, it was a total rejection of the physical world's legitimacy. They saw it all as a cosmic scam, and they were not afraid to say it. That's why the church saw them as such a huge threat. Gnosticism wasn't just about personal belief, it was a full-scale revolt against the entire structure of reality that mainstream Christianity was promoting. If the physical world was a trap, if the creator was a fraud, then what did that mean for everything the church stood for? That's why Gnostic texts were banned, not because they were some fringe cult, but because they were asking questions that could tear down the entire foundation of Christian doctrine. And let's not forget, Gnostic ideas didn't just vanish when the church started suppressing them. They went underground, kept alive in secret communities and in texts that didn't see the light of day for centuries. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in Egypt in 1945, is full of Gnostic texts that had been hidden away since the 4th century. These writings show a radically different version of Christianity, one where the real enemy isn't just Satan, but the very fabric of the world itself. Let's talk about Lucifer. Now, most people hear that name and immediately think, Satan, right? But hold on a second, the story of Lucifer is a lot more complicated, and honestly, it's not as straightforward as we've been led to believe. First off, let's start with the basics. The name Lucifer literally means light bringer or morning star. Doesn't exactly sound like the Prince of Darkness, does it? And here's the thing, it wasn't always a name associated with Satan. In fact, the whole connection between Lucifer and Satan is something that came much later. In the Bible, the word Lucifer appears in Isaiah 14, verse 12, where it's talking about the fall of a morning star, but the context suggests it's about a Babylonian king. So where does this idea that Lucifer equals Satan even come from? Well, the early Christian writers started reading that verse as a symbol for Satan's fall from grace. You know, the whole rebellion against God, cast out of heaven story. But here's what's interesting, Lucifer wasn't always seen as evil. Some early interpretations painted Lucifer as a tragic figure, an angel who fell not because of pure malice, but because of his desire to bring enlightenment. Think about that for a second. Lightbringer? Enlightenment? Could it be that Lucifer's fall was about something more than just pride? In some ancient stories, Lucifer's rebellion wasn't about defying God for the sake of evil. It was about challenging God's plan because he believed there was a better way. A smarter way. This is where you start to see a different perspective, one where Lucifer isn't just this evil figure lurking in the shadows, but rather a being who questioned authority, who sought to bring knowledge to the masses. Some even go as far as to say that Lucifer could be seen as a liberator, someone who wanted to free humanity from ignorance, from the constraints placed upon them by the divine order. Now, before you think this is too far out there, let's remember that this whole idea of Lucifer as a bringer of knowledge actually has some roots in ancient traditions. In Gnosticism, yeah, those guys again, there was a belief that the material world was created to trap souls in ignorance, and who comes along to challenge that ignorance? Lucifer, the bringer of light, the one who offers knowledge, much like the serpent in Eden who gives Adam and Eve the knowledge of good and evil. So could Lucifer have been misunderstood all this time? Could this figure, seen as the ultimate villain, have actually been trying to liberate humanity from a flawed creation? It's a bold idea, one that flies in the face of thousands of years of religious tradition. And here's the thing, when you start looking at texts like the Book of Enoch or the Dead Sea Scrolls, you start to see that the lines between good and evil, rebellion and enlightenment, aren't as clear-cut as we've been taught. In some of these writings, rebellious angels aren't depicted as purely evil, but as beings who defy God for a reason they believe is right. Now let's dig into one of the most epic concepts in ancient texts, the war in heaven. This isn't just some celestial spat, it's a full-blown cosmic battle that might hold the key to understanding how creation itself came to be. And here's where things get interesting. What if the very act of creation started with chaos and rebellion? First, we need to understand something crucial. This idea of divine beings fighting for control over the cosmos isn't unique to Christianity. It shows up everywhere in ancient mythology. In the Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, the world is born out of the violent clash between Marduk and the chaos monster Tiamat. Sound familiar? That's because the Bible borrows from these same themes. You see similar stories of chaos versus order, creation emerging from conflict in Egyptian, Canaanite, and Mesopotamian mythologies. But here's where the biblical twist comes in. The war in heaven, the story of Satan and his angels rebelling against God, could actually be about much more than a heavenly power struggle. It could be the very foundation of how the material world came into being. In Revelation 12, we get the classic image of Satan as the dragon, leading a third of the angels in rebellion only to be cast out of heaven. But what if this isn't just an afterthought? What if it's the catalyst for creation itself? Here's what some ancient texts suggest. Creation didn't just emerge from a peaceful divine act. It came from conflict, from chaos being beaten back by order. Satan's rebellion could represent the force of chaos trying to assert itself over the newly forming order of creation. In this sense, the earth and the universe we know aren't just God's handiwork. They're the product of a struggle, a battle between competing cosmic forces. Now, if we go back to Genesis, there's already this hint of chaos. In Genesis 1 verse 2, the earth was formless and empty, darkness was over the surface of the deep. That deep is often associated with Tihom, a chaotic abyss, possibly a nod to the ancient sea monster Tiamat from Babylonian myth. So, even in the biblical creation story, there's this sense that the earth started as a chaotic, dark place and God had to impose order on it. So where does Satan fit into all this? Well, if you think about the war in heaven as part of a larger cosmic battle between chaos and order, Satan's rebellion wasn't just a moral failing, it was a force trying to prevent creation from happening in the first place. Or maybe, and here's the controversial part, maybe Satan wasn't trying to destroy creation, but to reshape it. What if his rebellion was an attempt to create his own version of the universe? There are ancient texts, like the second book of Enoch, that suggest the rebellious angels were involved in shaping parts of the material world. In these accounts, angels had dominion over various aspects of creation, and Satan's rebellion could be seen as an attempt to control or influence how the physical realm came into existence. If creation began with chaos and rebellion, then what does that say about the nature of our world? Is the earth inherently a battleground, where chaos and order are constantly in tension? And if Satan had a hand in shaping that battle, does that mean the material world we live in is marked by his influence from the very start? This flips the traditional narrative on its head. Instead of creation being this perfect act, we're looking at a universe born out of conflict, where rebellion and chaos are baked into its very fabric. And Satan? He's not just the adversary, he's a player in that cosmic drama, maybe even a creator in his own right, trying to impose his own vision on the universe. All right, let's talk about the serpent in the Garden of Eden. You know the story. Eve gets tempted, she eats the fruit, and boom, sin enters the world. The serpent, often equated with Satan, is the ultimate bad guy in this narrative. In Genesis, the serpent is described as more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. Genesis 3 verse 1. But nowhere in this text does it directly say, hey, this is Satan. That connection comes way later from early Christian interpretations. In the original story, the serpent is just a talking creature offering knowledge. And what does it offer exactly? The knowledge of good and evil. It wasn't offering death, it was offering awareness. Now, let's think critically here. What's so bad about knowing the difference between good and evil? Isn't that kind of crucial for, I don't know, making informed decisions and living a morally responsible life? And yet, in this story, God is the one who doesn't want Adam and Eve to have that knowledge. So the serpent, far from being a pure agent of evil, might actually be a figure of liberation. In fact, in certain Gnostic texts, the serpent is seen as the hero of the story, someone who frees Adam and Eve from ignorance, helping them become aware of their true potential. The Gnostics even went as far as to say that the God who forbade Adam and Eve from eating the fruit wasn't the real God at all, but a lower controlling deity, the demiurge we talked about earlier. From this perspective, the serpent becomes a liberator, an ally, someone trying to wake humanity up to the truth of their existence. And let's not forget, knowledge is power. The serpent doesn't force Eve to eat the fruit, it simply tells her the truth. God said they would die if they ate it, but the serpent said, you will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat from it your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Genesis 3 verses 4 to 5. And guess what? That's exactly what happens. Their eyes are opened, they gain knowledge, they don't drop dead on the spot. So, here's the twist. Could it be that the serpent wasn't lying? Could it be that the serpent was offering humanity something that was being kept from them? In Gnostic terms, this isn't about defying God for the sake of evil. It's about breaking free from a system designed to keep humans in ignorance. The serpent, in this light, is a symbol of enlightenment, not destruction. But why would the church demonize this figure? Simple. Knowledge is dangerous. If you can control what people know, you can control how they think, how they act, how they live. The serpent, as a symbol of knowledge, was a threat to the entire structure of divine authority. That's why later interpretations, especially in the Christian tradition, transform the serpent into Satan, the ultimate enemy. In a way, the whole Eden story becomes less about disobedience and more about the fear of free thought. Adam and Eve weren't punished for breaking a rule, they were punished for waking up, for realizing that there was more to their existence than blind obedience. And who was the one who gave them that wake-up call? The serpent. Now that we've covered some mind-blowing reinterpretations of the classic stories, let's talk about the books that didn't even make it into the Bible. That's right, there are entire texts, alternative creation stories, and hidden accounts that were left out of the Bible we know today. And you've got to wonder, why? Ever heard of the Apocrypha? These are the ancient texts that didn't make the cut during the formation of the biblical canon. Some of them were widely read and considered important by early Christians, but by the time the church decided which books were official, these were tossed aside. We're talking about texts like the Book of Enoch, the Apocalypse of Adam, the Gospel of Philip, and the Book of Jubilees. These writings contain alternate visions of the creation story, some of which are downright shocking. For example, in the Book of Enoch, you get a wild story about angels descending to earth and mingling with humans. These angels, called the Watchers, disobey God and give humanity forbidden knowledge, kind of like the serpent in Eden, right? They teach humans about magic, weaponry, and astrology, and what happens next. Humanity spirals into chaos, leading to the flood that wipes out most of civilization. The takeaway here? Angels, these divine beings, are shown influencing human history and creation in ways that don't fit neatly into the mainstream Christian narrative. And then there's the Apocalypse of Adam, another Gnostic text. In this one, Adam tells his son Seth that the God who created the world wasn't the true, ultimate God. Adam reveals that a higher, hidden God exists, and the creator of the material world is actually a lower deity. Again, echoes of the demiurge. This story challenges the very idea that the God who created the world is the same one who deserves worship. According to the Apocalypse of Adam, creation is flawed because the creator is flawed. That's a pretty direct contradiction to the Genesis story we all know, where creation is good and God is perfect. These kinds of ideas were dangerous to the early church. If people started believing that the world was created by a lower, imperfect being, that could undermine everything about Christian doctrine, everything from the nature of God to the purpose of salvation. That's why these texts were hidden away, labeled heretical, and left out of the official Bible. But it's not just the Gnostic texts that got sidelined. Even Jewish texts like the Book of Jubilees offer a different version of creation in the early world. The Book of Jubilees tells the story of creation in much more detail than Genesis, and it includes timelines, specific actions of angels, and an emphasis on cosmic order that goes beyond the usual Genesis narrative. It also focuses on the Sabbath as a central part of creation, something that doesn't get nearly as much attention in the canonical Genesis account. Why did the church decide to leave this book out? Possibly because it didn't fit the tidy theological package they were putting together. These span books don't just offer different perspectives on the past, they also hint at a future where our understanding of the divine and creation could change again. Think about it. If these alternative stories had been included in the Bible, our entire worldview might be different today. We might see creation as a chaotic, ongoing process rather than a single perfect act. We might see God as one of many divine beings vying for control, or even as a flawed entity trying to impose order on chaos. And Satan, the serpent, Lucifer, they wouldn't just be villains. They'd be part of a much bigger, more complex cosmic story. The church didn't just suppress these stories because they were weird or confusing. They did it because these texts were a threat to the very structure of power they were building. If people started believing that the material world was inherently flawed, or that knowledge and rebellion weren't necessarily evil, it could upend the entire system. These banned books were dangerous, not because they were false, but because they offered a different truth, one that could inspire people to think for themselves. So what's the takeaway here? It's simple. The Bible we have today is only one version of the story. It's the version that won out in a long, messy battle of ideas. But that doesn't mean it's the only version, or even the most accurate one. There are entire texts that were hidden, erased, or banned because they didn't fit the narrative that the early church wanted to promote. And those texts, they hold some seriously different ideas about creation, the nature of God, and humanity's place in the universe. It's like finding the director's cut of a movie that changes the entire story you thought you knew. These banned books offer a glimpse into a world where the lines between good and evil, creator and deceiver, are a lot more blurred than we've been led to believe. Thanks for sticking with us all the way to the end. If this video made you think differently about what's really in and out of the Bible, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. We want to hear your thoughts down below. What do you think about these banned books? Should they have been included in the Bible? And what do they tell us about the creation story we know today? Until next time, take care and God bless us all.